Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the latest live episode of the Free Marketeers podcast. My name is Chris, Deputy Director at the IFMEF. Today, we're going to talk about all things expropriation without compensation, 75%, amending the Constitution, and all related matters. And to unpack this topic, I'm joined by Professor Robert Vivian from WITS. Prof, good morning. How are you?
I am extremely well, Chris, and how are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. I'm glad to hear that you're doing well. Before we handle this prickly topic, maybe you know some things that we don't, so you're going to help us unpack it. For those of you who don't know about Professor Vivian, he is Professor of Finance and Insurance at the School of Economics and Business Sciences at the University of the Witwatersrand, and he's also a member of the FMF's Rule of Law Board of Advisors. So, Prof, today we're going to talk about a presentation of yours. You're going to present a few slides and ideas for us. We're specifically talking about EWC and the so-called 75% requirement. Let me make sure that my slides are lined up, and then I'll give you a prompt to start talking to your slides. Okay, ready to go.
Okay, we're going to look at, as Chris has indicated, expropriation without compensation, and the requirement that in order to get to that point, you need to get 75% of the vote in Parliament. I'm not sure this is generally known or understood, and that's why it becomes an interesting comment, an interesting topic. Okay, next slide, Chris. Okay, the expropriation without compensation involves quite a wide range of things, and to deal with it properly, you need to deal with all of these things. Now, obviously, in one talk, we can't deal with all of these things, but why it's important to point it out is because when you deal with a specific aspect, as we are going to, other people have got other views from other areas and think these things are not understood or not dealt with. And so my view is you have to deal with all of these things systematically, but when you finish, you'll end up with quite a comprehensive and quite a complicated text to go through. So we're only going to deal with one thing. And on the slide, I've given an indication of what I think are some of the things that need to be dealt with. There is an earlier presentation which needs to be done in detail. We can't do it in detail today, which I've entitled Constitutionalism, Expropriation Without Compensation, and the South African Constitution. So to really understand this discussion, you really need to understand that earlier discussion. And I have suggested to Chris that if necessary, we can come back and do that earlier discussion. So bear in mind that we're not looking at the whole question of constitutionalism. We're only looking at the procedure which is now necessary, and that's the procedure to amend the Constitution. And the argument which I'll put forward is you need 75% of the vote. The other issues which are usually discussed, and in fact to such an extent that it eclipses the earlier two, is the question of restitution. Where does expropriation without compensation fit in with the question of restitution? And quite a closely allied but completely different thing is really land reform. It's a much broader concept than restitution. Where does that fit in with expropriation without compensation? And then the argument which many people put is if you have expropriation without compensation, we will end up like Zimbabwe, and therefore we shouldn't do it because we don't want to end up like Zimbabwe. And that really is an economic impact view of expropriation without compensation. Perfectly valid, but one needs to deal with that in the right context. So we're just going to deal with this second point, but it rests a little bit on the first point. So I'll give you a little bit of feed in to the second point by looking at the first point. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Okay, so this is the lecture the discussion we're not going to have in detail, and that's the discussion which I recommend that we should come back and have, because the 75% is really just flows from this. And this is a point which I refer to: constitutionalism, expropriation without compensation, and the South African Constitution. So where does constitutions fit into this? It fits into the debate because the English Parliament, or English society, it was more broader than Parliament, decided that Parliament was sovereignty. So there's a notion of parliamentary sovereignty. Now, parliamentary sovereignty says that Parliament can make any law that it likes, and it can unmake any law it likes. So if you believe in parliamentary sovereignty, then you can say expropriation without compensation is really legally not an issue at all, because all that's necessary is Parliament should pass that law. When parliamentary sovereignty was agreed to or understood in England, and it came after 400 years of debate, the issue was, we're not going to reopen that question. It's now settled. Let's get on with life. And so Sir Leslie Stephen then posed quite a famous question. And he says, if Parliament is sovereign and it passes a law to murder all blue-eyed babies, would that be a valid law? Sir Leslie was not against the idea that Parliament was sovereign. He was just saying, well, there may be a problem, and here's an example of the problem. So this question now becomes quite an important question, because it's a touchstone question. So Leslie did not answer the question. He assumed it would be perfectly valid for Parliament to pass a law putting all blue-eyed babies to death, because the English situation said, look, we're not going to have this debate, so it's gone. So he just tried to resolve it in a practical way and said, in a practical sense, of course, Parliament would never pass such a law, so we don't really have to worry about that type of thing. And if Parliament did pass that type of law, then nobody's going to obey it anyhow. So it's an academic question, not a real question. So that's where Sir Leslie left that question. So Leslie's daughters were much more famous than him. One was Virginia Woolf, and the other one was Vanessa Bell, a painter. And his cousin was much more famous than him. His cousin was A.V. Dicey. A.V. Dicey was the world's most famous constitutional jurist. Dicey then looked at his cousin's question, took his cousin's response, and said, yes, this is an interesting question, but let's just accept that Parliament's sovereign, so if it passes that law, it's valid. But like Sir Leslie, I agree, Parliament would never pass a law, so we won't look at that at all. Of course, that's not what happened in reality, because what we have is, for example, in Nazi Germany, millions of people were rounded up and exterminated. So countries did, in fact, do what Sir Leslie said they would never do. Now, the generals who ended up at Nuremberg, they then tried to use Sir Leslie's argument without reference to Leslie and say, look, we were just carrying out orders. We just soldiers, duty of a soldier is, theirs is not a reason why, theirs is but to do and die. So we just do as we're told. So it's got nothing to do with us. But the courts at Nuremberg wouldn't accept that. So it doesn't matter what the Constitution says, what the law says, it's a crime against humanity. So we leave the English situation with an uncomfortable position. Parliament can make any law it likes, but some laws they just will not make. But in reality, we know these laws have made. So the answer to that was what we now call constitutional democracy. The answer to that comes in constitutionalism. So the Americans, when they declared independence, said, look, we don't really have much faith in parliamentary sovereignty. So we want to introduce a new system, and this new system will be constitutional democracy. So that is the end of parliamentary sovereignty. So we can never get back to the argument that Parliament is free to pass any law it likes. That door is now permanently closed. It was closed in 1776 when the Americans declared independence and gave the world a new idea, which is constitutional democracy. We just need to correctly understand what that means. Door is closed, door cannot be opened. Now, some people get confused and think we can open that door, because what happens if we want to murder blue-eyed babies? Then all we have to do is we have to amend the Constitution and say we can murder blue-eyed babies, and then we can do it because it's in the Constitution. That's the argument we are basically facing in South Africa. So that's really saying Parliament is again sovereign, and we'll do it through the back door, we'll do it through the Constitution, but you can't open that door because that door doesn't exist anymore. So we are left with a very simple but powerful system. We have certain unalienable rights, and those rights are now protected by the rule of law. And the parliamentary democracy is a declaration that Parliament will never have the authority to put blue-eyed baby to death. That's a specific example, but the more general example will never be able to attack unalienable rights. The question of blue-eyed babies has now been settled once and for all. because the right to life is an unalienable right, and that's the right the babies have. So that's the end of that one. And the answer to that is the rule of law. And that's why the rule of law is such an important question. It protects against the violation of unalienable rights. Next question, next slide. Okay, so where does this come from? The United States Declaration, as I said, the world changed in 1776 when the idea of a constitutional democracy was ushered in, putting paid to the idea that Parliament can ever pass laws which violate inalienable rights. This is a statement which comes from the Declaration of Independence, sets the principles in place which constitutional democracy is rested. We the people hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, amongst these rights, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to protect these rights, to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So Parliament now exists on the consent of the people, and the people never have consented to violate their unalienable rights. Babies have never consented it. There is no way that any Parliament can claim that somehow, in some magic way, it's acquired some rights to be able to violate the unalienable rights. So that's what happened in 1776. I think the bigger problem is that people don't understand that, and part of today's discussion is just to try and get this idea over to society. There are these unalienable rights protected by a constitution, and no Parliament has ever and will ever have the right to violate those. Doesn't matter what Parliament you want to constitute. Next one. Next slide. So what is an unalienable right? It's a right to what we in fact have. So it's not a right to something which somebody can give us. So if we've got something, then you can't take it. So you can't take, it's a right to life, right to liberty, and right to property. These are also called by some people to be natural rights, but I prefer the American wording of unalienable rights, because natural rights could have a much broader thing. So if you have something, then nobody can take that from you, and the government can't take it from you. And the function of the government is, in fact, to protect that. Now, closely allied to the idea of unalienable rights is human rights. Human rights have become a little bit broader, and that's not a problem providing you understand what happened. We have the first generation rights, which is unalienable rights, the right to own the property which you've got, the right to not to have your life taken, so, the right to be free other than when you try to violate other people's rights. Those are the first generation rights. And then we get the second generation rights. Now, people who advocate human rights go immediately to the second generation and like to forget about the first generation. But you can't forget the first generation, because the first generation is the right to inalienable rights. Next slide. Okay, now what I have given to this point is just a very brief summary of a more comprehensive discussion, and that is a discussion of constitutionalism per se. So the conclusion from that discussion is what I have just given you. We can have a much longer discussion to go through that in greater detail, which we'll leave that for another day. So if you accept and understand what I've said, then there are two questions which we need to answer. Two questions with sub-questions to them. The first one, is expropriation without compensation a violation? Is it a violation of the rule of law? And is it racist? Now, it may be racist not in its wording, but it may be racist if it's executed on a racial basis. If it's executed on a basis, then there are other constitutional provisions which we can look at, the law against discrimination and things like that. So if you believe that this law of expropriation without compensation will be executed on a racial basis, then you're going to say, well, there's a valid and legitimate concern. So before that can happen, we need to have legislation in place to guarantee that it will not be executed on a racial basis. Okay, so those are the questions which we have to ask. Is it a violation of human rights? Is it a violation of the rule of law? And is it racist if executed? Now, why is it important to ask or to answer these questions? Because they are protected in terms of Section 1 of the Constitution. So if you want to violate any of those, then you would be violating Section 1. Now, in theory, you would have to get rid of Section 1 to violate any of those rights, which again, to make an amendment to Section 1 requires a 75% of the vote. So what we have to ask ourselves is, does expropriation violate any one of those three? If it violates any one, not all three, or not one or two, three, any one, then it is in violation of Section 1. Strictly speaking, if you wanted to do that, you would have to get rid of Section 1. So I argue that let's assume that there's a lesser possibility, and the lesser possibility is that you go to amend Section 25 with a 75% vote. Then you can have an argument. It's a bit of a far-fetched and fetched argument. Is we are going to leave Section 1 in place. We are going to violate Section 1. But when we know we're doing that, we're going to do that with something else which has got 75% of the vote. If we wanted to be formal, we could have gone back and repealed Section 1. We would have had the Section 75. Therefore, Section 25 with a 75% becomes a valid answer. As I say, that's a far-stretched argument, but it's the best option you got. The other option you got is to say, I'm sorry, it violates Section 1, and Section 1 has to be repealed. No one is talking at this stage of repealing Section 1 of the Constitution. So that's the logic. If it violates any of those three, then these are protected by Section 1. Section 1 to be amended requires Section 75%, and therefore anything that violates Section 1 requires 75%. I want to now amend Section 25 of the Constitution, and some people say Section 25 only requires 66%, but the amendments you want to bring in violates Section 1. Therefore, that would need 75% of the vote. That's the best argument you got. The proper legal argument would say, I'm sorry, I don't get what you do. Unless you get rid of Section 1, you can never do expropriation with compensation. Okay, next slide. Now, why do I make this point? Because there is a different view. Some people have. We can look at how this view arises and how in 1776, after that, when they brought in the American Constitution, Alexander was one of the debaters of the time, was quite aware that this argument would arise, and said, be very careful going forward about how you draw up a constitution, because you're going to run into the view, and this is the view that you've got. Since you have a section which is in the Constitution which allows expropriation, that section says you have to pay compensation. In order to get expropriation without compensation, all we have to do is amend that section. So this argument was well understood. So there's a commonly held view or perception. Expropriation without compensation is limited only by the existence of Section 25 in the Constitution. Thus, all that is necessary is to amend Section 25 of the Constitution. And that requires 66% of the vote. If we get that, then we can do what we like. So in terms of this view, everything is allowable provided it's not in direct conflict with the words of the Constitution. Therefore, this view says the democratic majority makes a majority legislative sovereign via the Constitution. Therefore, if you accept that, we are back where we started in the UK situation. Leslie Stevens' blue-eyed babies can be put to death. So we've now dealt with that argument. That argument carries no weight at all. So you cannot say we can expropriate property without compensation simply by amending 25, because that's what seems to stand in our way. It's not that what stands in the way. It's Section 1 that stands in the way, and behind that is the rule of law and racism and human rights. So even if you amended our Constitution to do whatever you like, outside of our Constitution, those are the three things which will still stand in the way. So the point I'm making over here, the commonly perceived view is, in order to expropriate compensation, in order to expropriate property without compensation, all we have to do is amend Section 5. That view is deeply flawed. And there's a lot of people who hold that view, and a lot of people who should know a lot better who hold that view. Okay, next slide. Let us have a look at the proposed amendment, and then you'll see that they want. And this is the amendment that they proposed to Section 25. This is the amendment which has come out by for comment. So they want to substitute other sections which exist in Section 25 with these. Subject, that is, expropriation will be done subject to compensation, the amount of which and the time and manner of payment shall either be agreed by those affected or directed or approved by a court. So what they're saying is we're going to amend the section as it now stands, and as the common law of the Constitution now stands. There is no such thing as expropriation without compensation. Difficult to do expropriation at the best of times. If you did do it, then you have to pay compensation. So now we want to get rid of this, and we're going to say it's either the amount you agreed or which has been approved by a court. Now, obviously, trying to insert this thing is to try and give some facade of legality to say, you know, we're not going to do it arbitrarily. A court is going to go and decide. Well, the court can't decide. The court can only decide whether you're expropriating property, and then can order it can only be done with compensation, providing it's within the grounds of expropriation. So now the second part of it is interesting, is what court, and what's the court decision the court can make. Provide that in court in terms of Section 3A, which is set out below, a court may, whether land or any improvements there are expropriated for purposes of land reform, determine the amount of compensation is law. So the argument, or the sleight of hand which they're trying to get to say, we want to have expropriation without compensation. We know that's going to cause a lot of problems. So we will assign it to a court, and then a court can do it at nil compensation. Okay, when will a court decide to do it? We'll still pass legislation in the future. So national legislation must, subjects 2 and 3, set out the specific circumstances where a court may be determined that compensation is nil. Now, that national legislation is not mentioned in the amendment. Now, you can't do this because what you're going to say is the Constitution protects against expropriation without compensation. Now, to avoid this, what we will say is we can pass another law later down, which will allow us to do that. So we'll take the question of expropriation without compensation away from the Constitution, and we will just go and do it. Now, what has happened at the same time, there has been a new expropriation bill which has been circulated, and the date for that has closed. Now, when I looked at that bill, I argued that that bill is totally unconstitutional as long as Section 25 is in place. And that what they would have to do is they would have to first amend Section 25. And once they amended Section 25, then they would go and argue, okay, we have the national legislation that's in place. So one has to be careful then that the compensation bill, which has come out for compensation, might be regarded then as the legislation. So one must have another look at that legislation in greater detail. But again, no court can determine nil compensation because the fundamental principle which exists, and you cannot shift the decision to take compensation or expropriation and compensation out of the court and say, okay, a court will now decide. You can't do that. That would be a violation of yet some more principles of the rule of law. Okay, so the proposed amendment itself simply is unconstitutional as it stands, even before we start looking at the other complications which we got. But for our purposes, if this proposed amendment is going to lead to expropriation without compensation, then that is what we're looking at, and that would be unconstitutional at the best of times. And the best argument we can have now, or those in favour, is you need to at least get 75%. So even if you want to now continue with this discussion can only be continued after Parliament has got 75%. And then all the other arguments will come to play. So it doesn't solve the problems at all. Next slide. Okay, now I have explained what I'm about to explain, so it should be clear. I've already set the framework to understand. I'm now going to provide the more legal details as to why this is true. Section 1 of the Constitution reads, "The Republic of South Africa is one sovereign democratic state founded on the following principles: human dignity, achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms. It is on non-racism and sexism, and the supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law." So if you violate any one of those three, you violate the very fundamental principles upon which the Constitution rests and which the Republic of South Africa rests. So now the question is, if you want to violate them, how are you going to do that? So one way, as I've argued, you go and say, okay, we're going to amend Section 1. We'll get rid of Section 1. It's a matter of interest. Is our Constitution with these three provisos is unique in the world. There's no other Constitution in the world which has the founding principle, the rule of law. In fact, the United Kingdom recently pointed out there hasn't even got an act of parliament. A very recent one came which mentioned unique. It bases our Constitution in rule of law and the advancement of human rights. So if you violate human rights or the rule of law, then you violate the very existence of the Constitution. So that's why I have to say the best option you've got to say, okay, let's get rid of Section 1. That would require 75% of the vote. We're not going to get rid of Section 1. We're going to pass a provision one I've looked at, which actually violates all three of those. The third one, non-racial, it just depends on how it's going to be implemented. And therefore, you can say, well, it's a non-starter. You violate Section 1, it's a non-starter. It can't be done because you violated Section 1. If you want to get rid of that, then you have to first get rid of Section 1, which is correct. And what I say is there's a halfway argument. You can go and you can say, okay, we can't get rid of Section 1. We don't want to get rid of Section 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass an amendment to Section 25. But we will do that with 75%. If we do that with 75%, then we can argue, well, we could have amended Section 1 or got rid of Section 1 because we had the vote. And therefore, it doesn't really matter because we've got Section 75 for amending Section 25. Next one. Okay, so expropriation of without compensation. One is a violation of the rule of law. It is a violation of first-generation human rights and almost certainly will be applied in a racist fashion. So even if, when you look at the amendments and you say, look, the amendment did not mention race at all, and therefore the amendment will not violate non-racial requirement, in the arguments you can put forward, well, we all know why it was passed, we all know how it's going to be applied, so it will be racist. And therefore, to overcome that problem, to make sure that the application will not become racist in its application, you can make a strong case, and we need to have a second piece of legislation, or the national legislation referred to, which does not yet exist. We'll have to have many provisions in there to ensure that its application is not applied in a racial way. Because if its application is applied in a racial way, you're going to get a violation of Section 1. Okay, in this discussion, I'm not going to have a big discussion on why expropriation without compensation is a violation of the rule of law, because I've done do that in an earlier one. Let me just sum it up. If we're going to have a situation which we say is Parliament is not sovereign, so if Parliament is not sovereign, then what would protect us is a constitution, and therefore the protection is only in terms of that constitution. We have no other protection than the constitution and the courts. And so if anybody wants to violate any of the fundamental rights, unalienable rights, say for example, somebody wants to put you in jail because they say you have broken a law, and in terms of breaking that law, the penalty is to go to jail. And you say, well, you can only do that through the rule of law. And the rule of law requires, one, you have to break a law, and two, decision has to be made by an independent and impartial judge who will guarantee through his analysis and looking at the evidence that you have in fact violated that law. So the protection which exists now in a constitutional dispensation is first of all the law, and the basic law over here is that unalienable rights cannot be violated. And those rights, if that argument is you yourself have violated a right by murdering somebody, by stealing somebody's property, then under those circumstances, you can go to jail or we can impose a fine. But to do that, we have to take you to a court of law and present a court of law, and therefore the rule of law comes to play. Now, I'm not sure, I've made this point in other discussions, and it's not everybody understands this, so let me just point a little bit clearer. If you are accused of violating a law, and it is because of that you should go to jail, there's actually a three-stage process there. So over the centuries, this process has become so watertight to make sure that you don't go to jail accidentally. And there's a three-phase process which has to be involved. And each three of these stages are independent of the other. The first is whether or not you violated that law has to be investigated by the South African police. So it has to be investigated by a separate impartial body. Now the South African police has no authority or ability whatsoever to put you into jail. When the analysis has been done by the police, it has to pass it on to a second body, and that second body is the public prosecutor. Public prosecutor has no authority to carry out the investigation. The public prosecutor can only take the evidence which has been gathered by the police and be presented to the third body, which is a court. So you can understand that the rule of law embodies a whole lot of processes to make sure that the constitutional safeguards are upheld. So if somebody wants to now take your property from you as an expropriation without compensation, first of all, they can't because it's a violation of national laws. Then, if you object to it, it has to follow a very detailed process, and ultimately, it has to be decided by a court of law. And ultimately, that court of law can only make two decisions. One, is the state justified in taking your property? Therefore, it's got to be done in terms of the law. And secondly, are you being paid compensation for that? So that's the role of the rule of law and the courts. Now, as you see from the so-called amendment, that's going to be done with a court going to start nil compensation. And we don't know why it will be nil compensation. That will be spelled out in another piece of legislation. So clearly, to take property without compensation is a violation of the rule of law. You can't violate the rule of law because the rule of law forms the foundation of the very constitution we've got. So if you don't like it, get rid of it. What is that going to require? 75%. Okay, they're not going to do that because that's going to create massive other problems. So what we're going to go and do is we're going to go amend section 25. Okay, do that with, first step, do that with 75%. When you've got that, we're not altogether clear whether you will still be able to achieve it. Unlikely that you will, but we leave that discussion for a later date. This discussion is just to make it clear that expropriation, section 25, which is planning to do what it wants to do, it's going to require at least 75% approval from Parliament. Secondly, it is a violation of the first generation human rights. Now, what happened here, an interesting thing. The rule of law is such a well-known concept. They asked Chief Justice Brigham, Cambridge University, invited him to present a lecture. And they said to him, could you come present a lecture, a very prestigious lecture? And he then said to Cambridge University, yes, but what would you like me to present it on? And they said, look, you can present on anything you like. And Chief Justice Brigham said, look, he found this to be a very, very nerve-wracking experience because as a judge, and he's been a judge his whole life, he's used to people giving him problems to solve. It's never been given the opportunity to pick his own thing. He said, look, I'll pick a very simple topic because I don't want something too complex, and I will pick a simple. We all know the rule of law. So he told Cambridge University, okay, he'll come present a paper on the rule of law. Then as he prepared that paper, he realized that actually nobody knew what the rule of law means anymore. And so he then did a great deal more work on it. And in fact, he worked on it until his death. And just shortly before his death, or maybe even shortly after his death, the little book he brought out on the rule of law was published. Now, if you read his book on the rule of law, he looks at it in a very academic and abstract way, which we really don't want to get into. He said, look, we can divide the rule of law into 10 different requirements, and then each chapter that he wrote has one. One of those is a violation of human rights. If you violate a human right, and in that he says first generation human rights, second generation human rights. And in the first generation human rights, he says, look, an obvious example where the human rights has been violated is in Zimbabwe. I don't even have to explain it to you, but that's it. When you take people's property without paying compensation, it's a blatant violation of first generation human rights. So if you wanted to have an argument, we don't have to, because I explained the human right is a right to something you've got. If somebody wants to take something which you've got, first of all, they can't, and certainly if they do, they have to pay compensation for that. But so we know what it is. But if you wanted, lawyers like to have much more authority than simply the principle. If you wanted black and white from Chief Justice and the World Authority on the theory of human rights, you can take someone's property without compensation, then that is a violation of human rights. So two of the provisions in Section 1 are violated with expropriation without compensation. And the third will almost certainly be violated, and we don't need to violate all three. So Section 1 gets violated. Section 1 requires 75%. So to bring that amendment, which I've already indicated to you, to pass that amendment, which is flawed as it is, 75%, or we don't even talk. There's no discussion until the 75% comes. When it is passed, if it is passed, then we'll continue the discussion, because that's not the end of the problem. That's really only the beginning of the problem. As somebody once said to me, and it turns out that is perfectly correct, said, what is the rule of law? The rule of law is a civilized way of maintaining a constitution. The rule of law is when we can see you violated the rule of law. You may violate it, as happened in Nazi Germany. People were murdered. That doesn't mean you can get away with it. What it does mean to everybody else, us and the international community, is the rule of law is violated. Then we know that we need to take steps to be able to deal with that violation. So that's the civilized way. It tells us, okay, let's go and see what steps can be taken when you violate it. Okay, so expropriation without compensation will violate all of the provisions of Section 1 of the Constitution, which requires a 75%. That point I'm trying to make. Next slide. Okay, so if we can just summarize it. Thus, expropriation without compensation is a violation of basic human right. It is racist, if nothing else in its application. It's a violation of the rule of law. It is therefore in breach of Section 1. Section 1 would have to be amended to remove it. In other words, we would have to go and remove the Constitution, which makes it the greatest constitution in the world. So we would have to get rid of that to tell the world we no longer have a great constitution. We want to admit that our constitution is a violation. Our actions are now a violation of human rights. They are racial and they violate the rule of law. They're not going to do that. But if you wanted to do that, it would take 75% of the vote. There is no suggestion that Section 1 is going to be abolished, which you would need to do. And so all you can do is say, okay, we're going to pass Section 25 with 75%, and we will then argue that because we did that, it can be assumed that we had sufficient authority to violate Section 1. If we wanted to, we didn't do it, and therefore we leave Section 1 in place by getting 75% to carry out the amendment. Next slide. Now, if Section 1 is not amended, that is, if it's not abolished, then Section 25 is going to violate Section 1. It's going to violate it in any year. and therefore it will create an interesting problem where a provision of the Constitution itself would then becomes unconstitutional. The way to live with that absurdity or that contradiction is to say, well, the amendment was passed with 75, so we got 75%. So therefore, we've achieved enough. So I say that is a possible argument, but a weak argument that you pass it with 75. And that's the argument. You simply say, well, we could have passed amended Section 74, Section 1 with 75%, and therefore it's not necessary to get 75. Whether that argument is a valid argument, I doubt it, but that is an argument which you could put forward. That is the best argument you could put forward. Any other argument will simply say the amendment which you've now posed is a violation of Section 1 and therefore is utterly and totally unconstitutional. Okay, next one. Next slide. I think must be about the last slide now, I think. Just about the last. What we have seen is that Section 1 forms the foundation of the Republic of South Africa, the Republic itself, the idea of the Republic. It's an important concept. I deal with it in the earlier lecture. That's when the Americans said, we the people. It has got enormous implications to the Constitution. So Section 1 by itself is fantastic as it stands. But Section 2 just adds a little bit more meat to it. This Constitution is the supreme law of the Republic, and any law or conduct inconsistent with it is invalid, and the obligations imposed by it must be fulfilled. So any law which is passed becomes invalid, and the obligations imposed on the Republic by the Constitution must be fulfilled. So there's absolutely no way you can pass an amendment to the Constitution to expropriate without compensation, without 75%. We can't even have a conversation until that happens. Once that happens, then there'll be many more very interesting conversations which will pass. Now, what happens when you pass this legislation and when you pass the other national legislation referred to, then any legislation passed in terms of the amended Section 5, Section 25 would be invalid. So any expropriation bill that you bring out, that would be invalid because you didn't meet the obligation. The obligation to uphold basic rights on a non-racialism and the rule of law is entrenched in Section 2. So I think you can see, I understand what happened is when they drafted the Constitution, they did not have any plan or intention to violate the Constitution. Now they want to violate the Constitution. Not unusual when people are not in power, they have high ideals, they quickly lose those ideals once they are in power. So that's why we need a Constitution which is impartial, it exists and embodies these very fundamental principles, which our Constitution indeed does. Get rid of Section 1, our Constitution then becomes nothing but a set of words and is nowhere near the greatest Constitution in the world. With those provisions in, it is the greatest Constitution in the world, but those provisions cannot simply be empty words. They have to be adhered to. Next slide. Implications of removing the offensive phrases in Section 1. So if you follow the argument, you said, okay, I'm now going to get rid of Section 1 in its entirety. Nobody's going to do that, but what would be the implication? So these are the conversations we will have if the Parliament manages to get 75%. So these are the conversations which we will come to. That's what I said, getting 75% is not the end of the debate, it's just the beginning of the debate, but we can't have that debate. There's no need to have that debate until you have Section 25. Okay. It in fact will make no difference at all. So if you pass this law with 75% or you get rid of Section 1, all it would mean is a basic human right, the right the right not to have your property taken from you, the right not to have your life taken from you, not to have your liberty taken from you. That simply would mean that is violated. If you do it on a racial basis, it simply means that South Africa is racist. It would violate the rule of law, simply means South Africa is operating outside of the rule of law. These concepts, human rights, non-racialism, rule of law, they do not get their credibility from the South African Constitution. South African Constitution is not what makes those concepts fundamental concepts around the world. It's the other way around. The Constitution gets its credibility and legitimacy by upholding these concepts. Violate those concepts, that's the point I'm making. You lose all credibility and all validity. Next slide. Must be the last slide by now. Yeah, the conclusion with regard to Section 1. It does not matter which way one looks at it. It is a requirement of Section 1 must first be addressed before amending Section 25 is addressed. Section 21 cannot simply be ignored. Section 1 can be amended or replaced in its entirety. This requires a vote of 75%. Since it can be argued Section 25 is implicitly amending Section 1, amending Section 25 requires a 75% vote. Now, the South African Constitutional Court, which will be faced with these arguments, may simply agree with the public perception and public argument. No. We amended the Constitution. We can kill blue-eyed babies as long as we do it in the Constitution. It's a puerile argument, but they say the good goes. What does that mean? Well, it means the Constitutional Court will lose all credibility, both locally and internationally. And secondly, what does it mean to the Constitution? Well, at the moment we try to say that the Constitution is the greatest constitution in the world. Constitution then loses its credibility. So it's not a good idea to continue with expropriation without compensation. But at this point of view, the only argument we want to put forward, not the more complex arguments, as I indicated in the first slide, there are other arguments which can be raised. We can deal with those, but we'll deal with them separately. At this point of view, simply views, unless you get 75% to amend Section 25, Section 25 is not validly and constitutionally amended, and it doesn't mean a thing. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Prof. Quite impressive, all the groundwork that you covered there, I think, and hopefully it's got some people thinking about the 75% question. Just a note that I checked beforehand. So in the 2019 general election, the ANC got 57.5%, or 230 seats. The EFF got 10.8%, 44 seats. So that's a total of 68.3% and 274 seats. So that's the state of play at the moment. For those of you watching, please put your questions in the comment section, and I'll put those to Professor Vivian if there's anything you want him to elaborate on or explain. Prof, we have one question from Stuart Pennington. He asks, what if it is alleged that the land that you quote unquote have was acquired illegally?
Okay, if you go back to my original slide, I said there are quite a few issues that one would have to look at. And one of them was the question of restitution. So one would then have to deal with that under the issue of restitution. I didn't want to deal with it today because I didn't want to bring all other issues into it. So if we have another discussion, I'm happy to deal with that, but deal that under the issue of restitution. So Section 25 already has provisions in it to deal with restitution. So the first point of departure is that adequate to deal with it? Has this current amendment been brought because it is inadequate, or is that simply a smokescreen? So it's a valid question, but it's not a question which needs to be dealt with in terms of whether you need 75% or not. It's a question which needs to be dealt with under the question of what does land restitution say about expropriation without compensation? And of course, there's a much broader concept, land reform. So land restitution would say is that this piece of property which you occupying, I can prove that that was unlawfully taken from my ancestors and therefore I want it back. Land reform is simply a much broader concept to say we just think that we should reform the land and therefore we want to take property to do it. But I don't want to deal in detail with those in this one. I'm happy to come back and deal with them. And that's what I said, when you finally finish this, it'll be quite a complex section. So if you ask me that, I'll say, okay, if you want to answer that, turn to Section 2. And let's go and have this discussion in Section 2. Section 3. Section 1 We'll deal with the principle of constitutionalism, South African expropriation, and the South African Constitution. So I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm ducking the problem, but it's not really ducked. It's going to be dealt with properly somewhere else.
Our next question from Jim Powell. Jim, it's nice to know that you're watching here. Hopefully one day we can get back to doing events and briefings here in the FMF offices, and people such as yourself can join us again and we can discuss all these matters in person. Jim just asked, will organizations such as the FMF, RR, or ALTA be willing to take a test case if EWC is used? Now, we probably can't talk on behalf of the other organizations. I don't know if you perhaps, Prof, want to talk about anything that the Rule of Law Board has talked about, if this sort of thing could happen. I know going to court would require a lot of money. So on that point, I will say support the FMF financially if you want us to go to court on anything. That's my in there. But what are your thoughts on that sort of thing? Should we look at going to the courts?
I think that the Rule of Law Committee certainly is looking at going to court. I think we have to take a step back and say, as a general principle, the Free Market Foundation doesn't see itself as a litigant. It doesn't see itself as, an activist organization trying to enforce its views. It seems it's more an organization that prefers to present rational arguments there. But as you say, the Free Market Foundation Rule of Law Committee, if nobody else, is seriously looking at testing this in court. We would also, like to know whether other parties other entities hold the same view. And, we, as you know, earlier on we had what we call a roundtable discussion to see what's the general feeling about these things. But I mean, would not be opposed to the idea of having another roundtable specifically on the question of what is the view. I mean, I have tried to present my view as clearly as possible to show that there's a lot of support for that view. Other people might have contrary arguments. I mean, any argument which is given as a valid argument, even a valid argument against it. So, but the answer to that is yes. The Free Market Foundation, at least as Rule of Law Committee, is happy to go to court. As you say, it does also depend on funding, so you need to be able to get financial support from a whole number of bodies to do this. But the answer to that simple question is yes. I think the Free Market Foundation may think other organizations are probably better placed to that, because it's not really what the free market traditionally has done. Free Market Foundation has taken cases to court. It has also taken courts as amicus curiae, so it's supported other people which have it. So the simple answer to that is yes. But we're not there yet because there's quite a few hurdles that need to be crossed to get to that point.
Prof, this is me trying to spot here, so maybe you can also dodge this question like you did the previous one by Stuart. Do you envision, any sort of timeline for when all of this can be or will be done? When we'll know for sure what final version of an amendment will be made or not? Is there anything that indicates to you the way that Parliament operates or that courts might operate or that sort of thing that gives you an idea of, in the next year or 5 years or 10 years, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, the timeline, so we should look at a couple of the first timeline linked back to the previous question about going to court. There's been a serious debate whether we should go to court right now. And that is, can we interdict Parliament from making a decision unless it gets 75%? We can say, maybe Parliament doesn't know about the 75%. Maybe Parliament wants to bypass it. And we say, no, we are convinced that Parliament needs a 75%. And so the question which we looked at, should we go to court right this moment, assuming that we had the funds to do it and the support to do that, and try to interdict Parliament and say to Parliament, we want you to compel Parliament not to make a vote unless you get 75%. Now that can be done. It has been tried before, and the Constitutional Court did not rule it out. Constitutional Court ruled they would prefer that you come after the act has been passed rather than before the act has come past. But it did say under certain circumstances we would look at taking action before the pass. And in our view, 75% and the expropriation in general falls within those exceptions. So that's the first one. The second question is a little bit more tricky because I actually think two things are happening simultaneously. And these two things are getting confused, and we need to try and separate them, and they may enter this. They may have reason for the confusion. The first thing is, when is the amendment going to be brought before Parliament? We don't know when that's going to happen. As far as I know, we don't know when that is going to happen. It's at a discussion stage. And as you know, or you may not know, this whole thing's been in limbo for some time. It started with great enthusiasm and then petered out, and sort of wondered why did it peter out. And now there's been a bit of a revival. And from the sort of announcements, and no inside information from this, it looks like it's going to be fairly recent. That, let's take the main Parliament, the one which I showed you on there. And obviously, there's nothing you can do about that until the national legislation referred to is also passed. So that leads us to the second question, whether the expropriation bill, which was out for comment, and there's been lots of objections to it, I think 80,000 individual objections to it. Parliament, the committee was then going to extend the verbal presentations. I'm not sure, it seems that they decided they're not going to do it. So it looks like that might get rushed through. So the question then which arises is, what is that national legislation? Is that the national legislation which is referred to in the proposal or not? So it seems to me, the simple answer to your question on it, timelines, I think the expropriation bill is going to be passed fairly shortly. Constitutional may be passed shortly thereafter, or they may reconsider it. And then the question is whether they're going to regard the expropriation bill as the national legislation. And if that's not adequate, are they then going to go say, okay, we have a bill of parliament, we can now amend that through the normal parliamentary process. It's what I have referred to as trying to bypass the constitution through the back door. So we use a parliamentary majority to make a decision, which is unconstitutional. Then that could lead to other action. Whether other parties are planning to take action on the 75%, I'm not sure. That's why I do think a good idea is to actually have a specific conference of the interested parties on the 75% to say, should we pursue with it? What are we going to do with it? If Parliament tomorrow passes it with the figures you've given, it looks like they're going to battle to get 75%, and they pass it with 66%. Do we launch an immediate action to say, okay, this is unconstitutional? And we just want a declaratory order. A declaratory order to say, we want you to declare you needed 75%, you didn't get it. Constitutional Court has said it doesn't want to look at cases before they are real. Now it is real. So that's what I think around table. I think it was frustrating myself and others. It's like the sort of lack of action. Expropriation's been going for a long time. And then it just petered out. And I don't think it should peter out. Okay.
Thanks very much, Prof.
And that didn't put me on the spot. That was an easy one.
Oh, okay. I thought it was going to be a difficult one, but never mind then. You're a lot faster than I thought. Thanks, Prof. We'll wrap up on there. Thank you very much for your time, your presentation, for your insights.
Okay, that's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. I think it's an important topic, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to try and explain it more clearly. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I think it was very good. Viewers and listeners, again, thank you to those of you who joined us this morning. And if you're watching this later today or later in the week, we hope you found it useful and insightful. Please remember before you leave to like the video. Please share it on your different social media platforms. And finally, remember to subscribe to the FMF's YouTube channel by clicking on the big red button underneath the video. You can find all of our articles, submissions, media releases on www.freemarketfoundation.com. And our annual fundraiser is going now until the 31st of March. So if you can, please consider donating to the FMF and supporting the work that we do. We'll end on that note. Take care out there, stay safe, and we'll talk to you all again very soon. Bye-bye.